I want to start by thanking the Oxford University Archaeological Society for this invitation to speak. Doing rock art is the title I've chosen because it is the actual doing of archaeology, the doing of rock art, not just reading about it, that makes it so fascinating. And it is something that everybody can do. But I want to start by mentioning two little things that I like to tell students. After a life in archaeology, you know, you reach a stage when you can give advice to people, and if they don't like it, they don't say anything because you're so old. But these are two things I want to say. One is when you start off as a student, even when you're a student, go for the jugular, and two, mine the richest seams. Don't have a career in archaeology where you're messing around with bits left over by other people. Get your own source of interest and make it central in some way, not just a subsidiary to something else. What does rock art hope to achieve? Well, it falls under the heading of cognitive archaeology, and I might mention here that Oxford University Press is bringing out a handbook devoted to cognitive archaeology. That is archaeology that deals with people's thinking, their beliefs, not just how they make a living by bows and arrows or something like that. And cognitive archaeology fills an important gap in what you might call traditional archaeology, because it supplies a component of life that is usually believed to be lost forever. When you say this is what the people who made these paintings were thinking, people tend to say, but that's lost. Those people have gone, they're dead. We can't possibly know what they believed. Well, that is, in Southern Africa, incorrect. And that is why I want to talk particularly about San rock art, that is formerly known as Bushman rock art. It is a rich and varied field. It's not a simple matter. The big picture there shows you one of the areas that are very rich in San rock art. And even if you don't find any paintings, you have a wonderful day out in those mountains. On the left, you can see there's a dark shadow. That's a large cave. The shadow is the length of the cave, a rock shelter, and there are many paintings in there. In the lower pictures, you've got three views of San rock art. On the left, you've got the little running figure, and that is more or less what people think San rock art looks like. But I would invite you to look more closely at that picture. Look at the arm, for example, that is out in front. And if you look closely, you'll see that he is holding an arrow. It's painted in white. Then you can see the little bit of red, and then there's a white point. Now, that figure fits into the palm of your hand. So we are dealing with miniatures here. You have to get up close to the paintings if you want to see them. They draw you in. You don't stand back and look at them. And then look at his face. You see the face is white. Now, is that body paint or is it something else? Look yet more closely and you'll see there are little red lines, thin red lines painted across it, which doesn't look all that realistic. So what is going on there? The next picture is in some ways the epitome of San rock art, a painting of the eland antelope. And again, there is detail. Look at the hump and then go to the right and you'll see there's a black line along the back of its neck. Then you'll see there are two ears. Then you'll see there's that tuft of red hair on the forehead of the eland. And then there's the black mark, which is the darkening of the eland's snout. Then come round underneath and you see the dewlap hanging there. And if you look closely, you wouldn't have seen it to start with. you can see there is hair painted hanging from that dewlap. Then you look at the feet, and he has black hoofs. Now that eland is superimposed on the legs of a very big figure. We can just see the lower part of the body and the legs. If you look at the feet of those legs at the back, you will see that they are not feet, but hoofs. And they link up with the hoofs of the eland. So there's an unexpected link, if you look close enough, between the eland and the human figure. And then we move on to the next painting, and you can see now we are in the realm of imagination. This is not a realistic painting, but again, look at the detail. The devil is in the detail. Look at the raised hand that is holding the arrows. White, red, white point. There's that detail again. The figure is also holding a bow. The stave of the bow is in red, and then the white is the string of the bow. Come down and you'll see animal ears, very strange head, and then two bunches of arrows that are stuck in a band around the waist. And they too, you see, white, red, white. And those sections of the arrows is a very clever invention. It's made so that when the point strikes the animal, the shaft splits and falls away, so that when the animal runs, it doesn't bounce up and down and work loose, and the poison that was on the tip of the arrow takes effect in the animal. So already we can see that we have a lot of detail if we look close enough. Now here we've got a painting that looks like a scene, a story. What can we say about a panel like this? This is actually quite a well-known painting. It was discovered at the end of the 19th century. There's an animal and there are human figures around it. People would say, they painted hunts. So it's a hunt, but what animal is it? Very curious animal. Some people thought it was an ox, but look at the tail. That little tail is not an ox tail. So we're again in the realm of, were they not very good painters, or is this what they wanted it to look like? But there are a large number of clues in this painting as to what it is all about. We want a sort of detective story here. Some people think that if you gaze long enough and then guess, you will know what it's about, because every picture tells a story. Well, it may tell a story, but it's not obvious by any means. And the evidence that we need is way beyond what some people imagine. I said at the beginning, people think that all the people who made the paintings are dead and we'll never know what they believed. Well, not entirely true. There is an ethnographic mosaic, not just one source, but a number of sources. And like a mosaic, those sources all fit together and they make a pattern. Let's start in the top left. There is a fold out from a magazine that was published in 1874. And there are four, one's not so easy to see, four groups of rock paintings there. And the man who made that copy was guided to those paintings by a San man by the name of King. And he told Orpen what those paintings are all about. And I'm sure you've already picked up that the little group in the top right, you see them there, four figures apparently leading another chunky sort of animal, and then two figures facing another version of the same thing. So there's a theme there that's we've picked up from that first painting we looked at. Now move to the right and you'll see a picture of Wilhelm Heinrich Emanuel Blake. His name is spelled B-L-E-E-K, but you pronounce it in the English version of it as you would Beethoven, so Blake. And he came to South Africa, first of all, with the quite controversial Bishop Colenso, and he did a Zulu dictionary. Then he moved to Cape Town, and he became aware of a number of Bushmen who had been brought to the jail in Cape Town. And nobody had ever studied their language carefully. And so he persuaded the governor of the Cape. The British had taken over the Cape from the Dutch by this time. And he allowed a number of these Bushmen to stay with the Blake family in their suburban home. And the anthropologists usually talk about informants who tell you things. The Blake family used the word teachers because the San people who came to live with them became their teachers. And then Blake developed a phonetic script, which you can see on the right. We'll look at that more closely in a moment. But he was able to write down word for word as they spoke. The language they spoke is called Kham, and it has long since been extinct. So nobody speaks it today. But if you can read the phonetic script, you can speak it today and pronounce the words that those people, all those century and a half and more ago, were speaking. Then we come in the lower pictures to the more recent ethnography from the 20th and 21st century. A number of people went to work in the Kalahari Desert, where I've got 2021 written. And there they worked with in those days they called them the Kung, otherwise the Zutwasi San. And there in the picture you can see there a medicine man or Ngumkhao is curing people, laying his hands on the woman. They're drawing the sickness out of her into his own body, and then in a moment he will expel it through a hole in the back of his neck. Now, that is much more recent than the level at the top, and people used to think that you couldn't use the older or the new ethnography and put it together with the older ethnography because they were different. But they are a mosaic. And when you put them together, contrary to what I used to think, they fit and they are very, very similar, even though the Bushman language itself is different. There we have 2 pages from the notebooks. The lady down right is Wilhelm Blake's sister-in-law, Lucy Lloyd. And she, although she wasn't a trained linguist as Blake was, she learned how to write down this amazingly difficult San language. And in fact, the 2 pages we're looking at there are in her handwriting, not in Blake's handwriting. The portrait up left is a man by the name of Thabo, and he was one of their principal informants or teachers. And his name, Thabo, means dream. And they thought of him as a philosopher because he always thought very profoundly before he told them something. Look at the page number. It is 6,366, I think. 6,000, not 600, 6,000. And if you think that's a lot, it's only halfway. There are 12,000 manuscript pages of myths, life stories, names, adventures, all from the lives of the Kham people. It's done in 2 columns, each page. Look at the page on the right. You'll see there's one column that is in the phonetic script, and then next to it, they have written a transliteration. So they're not paraphrasing, but they're doing it more or less word for word. And that is how, if you go through the 12,000 pages, you can become reasonably proficient, if not proficient, understanding of what was written down in that extinct language. Now, another source of clues is neuropsychology. I showed you the picture of the Numkhao curing that woman by drawing the sickness out. And on the right there is a sound person going into a trance state in order to contact the spirit world and to cure. Now, neuropsychology has studied what people experience in these altered states of consciousness. What they experience is caused by the human nervous system, the way the brain is wired. That means that people all over the world have some commonalities in what they experience. Inevitably, they will interpret what they see differently in different parts of the world. One of the things that they see is on the left, which is a vortex, a tunnel, and you feel yourself being drawn down that tunnel with pictures on the side of it. And in the middle is a painting from the Doge's Palace in Venice, where angels are gathering the dead, taking them up to this tunnel, down to the bright light at the end. Now, whether that is related to a trance experience, I leave it for you to understand. But the point I want to make is that the neuropsychology is secondary. Primarily, the multiple fit between sound ethnography and the imagery shows the imagery was associated with a ritual. And that fit between what was written down in the phonetic script and what we see on the rock face is surprising. You can't believe it sometimes, but that's the way it was. Then secondarily, that ritual indisputably involved altered states of consciousness. You can still observe it in the Kalahari today. And that means as a supplement, you can turn to neuropsychology for further light on what they painted. In the painting that we're looking at, there are 5 important clues. And this shows us how ethnography and neuropsychology work together. 2 examples. This is the first one, another one a little bit later, another painting, and we'll see another approach. Apparently, it is a narrative scene. A narrative scene in the sense this is what happened and somebody came home and painted it. Not as simple as that. First clue. Now we've gone back to that painting on the right that Orpen recorded and copied in the 1870s. 4 people are leading that chunky animal. Now, King, the young man who told him about this, said that they are catching a rain creature. They are underwater, they are catching a rain creature. When Blake showed this painting, the painting that we're looking at there, to his people, they said the same thing. And they said in their language, it was a kakahoro, which means animal of the rain. And they thought of the storm clouds as an animal. And you could lead, by mystical means, a storm cloud across the country. And the thunderstorm would walk on its legs, which you can see in the picture above, the rain's legs. I took the picture above with the Drakensberg Mountains in the background. So the animal, that chunky animal, which is no known species, if they wanted to paint an eland, as you've seen, it's recognizable by species. That is an imaginary animal, the rain animal. But there's a lot more there as well. The second clue is the shaman's eared cap. Now you can call the medicine man a shaman or something else. The Blakes used the word sorcerer, but we don't use that today. But if you look at the inset there, the man is wearing an eared cap. You see the little antelope ears have been sewn, and it's all described in the Blake manuscripts, up as 2 little ears with white paint as well, and then the darker thing. And then the arrows show you two figures that are wearing eared caps. Now that means that they are medicine men if they are wearing that. Now it's so small in that big painting, and it shows you how you've got to be drawn into the painting to look at those ears, pick it up, see that they've got these strange headdresses or caps. Go back to the figure above, and you'll see there are 3 arrows stuck between his back and a white kaross cloak that is thrown over his shoulder, and then that dark horizontal mark there is the quiver, and he's slung that over to keep the arrows in place. And they are painted out as before, white, red dots, tiny red dots, pinhead in size, red and then white. The whole picture fits in the palm of your hand. Now look at the bow. He's got an arrow in the bow, ready to shoot. It's horizontal there, you can just see it. And then he's got another arrow that is vertical. The string is in white as well. So he shoots the one arrow, brings this one down, shoots that, reaches behind him, gets one of the arrows, pulls it out, puts it in the bow, and he does that all while he is running, and the arrows just come like that, and that has been caught. So with the eared cap is the important thing here. The third clue is something that is easy to miss. It is what we call hand to nose, and the word for nose was ngu. And if you look at the inset, you'll see the figure has got one of the figures got his hand up to his nose, and the arrow is pointing to the eared cap figure again, which has a bent elbow, but he's got no legs. I should have pointed that out. He's got no legs. Now, why he hadn't got legs is a point in itself. The figure above has got arrows again, you see, behind his shoulder and touching his nose. And the nose was the seat, the location of the supernatural room, or that they were able to manipulate and use in the supernatural things, like catching a rain animal, leading it across the country, and then killing it so that its blood and its sweat, milk would fall as rain on the country. So they were able to control the movement of thunderstorms. Now here's something that nearly everybody misses. The red arrow is pointing to bees. The list with the easier top picture shows you the swarm of bees. Then below that, there are dancing people. Then there is a bending forward figure. Do you see his little cap? He's wearing one of the eared caps, so we know what he is. There's blood falling from his nose, and the blood from the nose is repeated in painting after painting. Then there is a strange creature with red lines on its face, and there's blood falling from its nose, and it has 2 long prongs coming out of its back. So what we're looking at in that painting is not real life. There are no such creatures. Similarly, the rain-making scene. But that line of crosses, which represent the bees, sometimes they painted the bees with the body dark and the wings, the 2 wings, in white. Amazing. Fit on your little fingernail, one bee. And it's coming, the bees are coming down in a line and striking the back, the hump of the rain animal. And the hump is a very important thing in an animal and in a human being, between the shoulder blades. They call it the ngao spot. Then we've got what we call the arms back posture, and that is our 5th clue. Maybe it's best to start with the picture on the right. There are 3 figures there, bending backwards, and their arms in the backward position, and long lines indicating the spirit leaving from the top of the head. The figure up left is a kneeling figure. You can't see the legs. You can see the two arms are back, and you can see the neck, and the face, I think, was in white. So the white paint hasn't lasted. It doesn't last as well as the red paint. So there you've got somebody in the arms back posture. Now, we saw the arms back posture all over the place in Southern Africa. Well, I say we saw it all over. What happens is you see it, and then you go to another rock shelter and you think, hello, I've seen that before somewhere. And you go back, yes, it's this odd position, arms back like that. What could it mean? And then you find it all over the place. And it might be like looking at stained glass windows in cathedrals where there are figures standing like this with their two fingers. And then you know that we know that they are giving a blessing. And what was the meaning of this? And we couldn't find out. We couldn't find it in the Blake and Lloyd manuscripts. Then I was in the Kalahari once, and we were talking to medicine people, and they said this and they said that. Then one of them, without seeing any paintings, because there are no paintings in the Kalahari, I hadn't shown them copies of this at all. One of them stood up and said, there's something else I think I can tell you. And I said, yes, what is it? And he said, when some people are asking Kawa, God, to put more potency into their spines, they bend forward and put their arms in this backward position. And that's when he did it. And my hair stood up on the back of my neck. What had puzzled us for years was suddenly explained. The posture is meaningful. There it is up top, arms back, asking God for more potency. So these clues add up. The evidence adds up. They complement one another, the clues. And we've got a rainmaking ritual in the spirit world. It's not a simple story of people going out to hunt. We've got all these clues to tell us what it's about, but it still appears to be a scene. Now, the second example is not an apparent story, but it's what we might call an image cluster. It's not a scene, but those images obviously belong together. There are 7 clues there, but just have a look at them to start with. At the bottom, there's this black area with a dotted line in it. And then you've got figures rising up out of that. There are fish, and then there are tortoises or turtles. One of the figures got a very clear antelope head, and then there's some fly whisks. Now we'll look at the clues there. The first clue is that deep crack in the rock, and they have smeared black paint on it to emphasize it, I think. And that particular crack is very deep. You can actually put your fingers in it. But sometimes it's just a crack in the rock, a line in the rock. And they are coming out of the crack. And that is because the spirit world was believed to be behind the rock face, on the other side of the veil, if you can call it that, between this world and the spirit world. And the paintings come through the veil, from behind, out through the cracks, and the painters make them visible for us to see. The lovely eland at the top, you could miss it, is actually stepping out of a crack in the rock. You see its hind legs? It is walking out from the spirit world into this world. While we're looking at it, look how beautifully it's shaded, how the red and the white shade. Look at the shoulder, the front legs, how it is formed. Look at the head, the ears, and you'll notice in the ear that's closest to us, there's a little red mark. That is the darker hair that exists in the hair, in the ear of an eland. Then there's the dark patch, there's the eye, a nose in black, then it followed under the chin, and then you'll see there's a tiny little knob on the side there, like an Adam's apple. That's also characteristic of the eland. Then you come down to the dewlap, more hair painted on the dewlap. That small dewlap like that means that it's a female eland. So the first clue is paintings coming out of the deep crack in the rock. And that is smeared with black paint. And it does seem that the smearing of the paint was like a solvent. It helped people to see through the veil of the rock face. The next clue is the fish, eels. How many eels can you pick out there? At least 2. Turtles or tortoises. Now, it's interesting that Blake and Lloyd went to the museum in Cape Town in the 1870s and showed them the animals, that stuffed animals and preserved animals, and asked them for the San names for these animals. And when they came to turtles and tortoises, they got in the muddle and they couldn't decide which word meant a turtle and which word meant a tortoise. And I think the reason is that the nomenclature in the San language is different from our Linnaean nomenclature. And they probably had a word like carapaced creature or something like that, that meant turtle and tortoise. But the turtles, the eels, the fish show that this is in some sense underwater. And that is indeed what Kring said when he spoke about the rain animal. They are all underwater. Now, going underwater is like going behind the rock face, going underground, going underwater into the spirit world. And the neuropsychology tells us that people experience a shortness of breath, a difficulty in breathing, a sense of floating in water. And that is what you experience in the spirit world. Then there are many fly whisks in a bunch up top there. Now the fly whisk in San society is not used for flicking away flies, so calling it a fly whisk is a misnomer. But they use them in the dance. And some of the people will tell you that as they're dancing in the medicine dance with the fly whisk, they use the fly whisk to flick away the arrows of sickness that the spirits of the dead shoot into people. Each man has one fly whisk. They don't have many, one man. They have many arrows, but they don't have many fly whisks. So the painter has painted a bunch of fly whisks, which is unrealistic, but it is a concentration of the potency that they use in the dance to flick away the arrows of sickness. Now, we've spoken about nasal blood. The picture I put back up there, the bending forward figure, bleeding from the nose, the curious animal, maybe it's a rain animal, we don't know, bleeding from the nose. And then one of the heads, look, it's a long thin neck coming up out of the black, is bleeding from the nose. Now, as soon as you get something like that, that clue, the bleeding, it means that those other figures are in some way related to spiritual experience, even if they're not painted with blood. We don't know why some are and some aren't. Then the sixth clue is what we call the therianthrope. That is half animal, half human, or part animal, part human. A beautiful antelope head there. The inset picture there is a raybuck head. Again, look at the red and the white paint, the eye, the nose, look at the ears, the red and white in the ears. And what else do you notice? Blood falling from the nose, one hand up, one finger too many, a white kaross, and then something that you probably wouldn't see unless you knew to look for it. Two heart-shaped objects or forms just below the hand, heart-shaped cordiforms we call them. Now they puzzled us for a long time too, because they are, like so much else, appear in painting after painting. What could they mean? Well, we eventually found that they are hoof prints of a particular species of buck. The eland hoof print is quite different, but the small buck have these little hoof prints. So this figure is bleeding from the nose. There's a line coming from the nose to the hand, and he is controlling by the hoof prints the movement of antelope. And eventually, as you get to know the details, these little meanings, not so little, begin to appear. The seventh clue is again a bit of a puzzle, more black paint. And people thought that that was a bag, perhaps, because you can see there are some fish tails sticking up out of it. Maybe I'm inclined to think that that black is very much like the black that they painted around the crack. And they were using the paint there as the solvent. And that is another opening gateway into the spirit world where the fish are. And all this is brought together in the cluster. So we've got a glimpse of the spirit world seeping through the veil of the rock face. The evidence adds up. Each of those clues is complementary to the other one. So although this is not telling a story like our first example, this cluster of images is deeply meaningful. And we can say that the San painters were depicting and also effecting transition between realms. I've put the rock face in the middle. On the left, the spirit realm. On the right, the material realm of daily life. And art and shamans, the medicine people, are able to move through the rock face and make the spirit realm real for the people who live in the material realm. And before we leave it, just look quickly at the head of that running figure on the left. Very peculiar. But there is a bird sitting on the top of his head with two wings up. And the medicine people turned into animals, we saw that, and also into birds. And in the shape of a bird, they could fly around, find out what's happening in distant places, come back and tell people. A puzzling painting, but when you know the ethnography and you know those 12,000 pages, you begin to know what it's all about. Some conclusions. One, summing up, the San ethnography dovetails with the neuropsychology. They fit together. Two, some images show what ordinary people could not see. You could talk about spirits and so on, but how could people imagine them? Well, they painted them. The images themselves move between the material and the spirit realms. This transition is going on. The conclusion is that religion was a potent factor in San society, not just an add-on. Now, I started by saying doing archaeology. I'll give you a minute to do some archaeology here. This is a copy. You can see the original of this in the museum in Cape Town, and a wonderful copy of it in the Origin Center at the University of the Witwatersrand. How many clues can you spot there? Fish, nasal bleeding, little black buck on the right, and then to the left there's an upside down snake with an antelope head, red lines on its face, and blood spurting. Eels, the supine figure, look at his hoofs. His hand, lower one, is holding a fly whisk. And then there is this line with buck walking on it that goes into the back of his neck, comes out from one hand to the eland, comes off the hoof to another eland, and wraps around the eland. We could talk for another hour, at least, about this painting. And that is the depth that is available to us. And there are many, many discoveries awaiting researchers. And look at the scenery. If you don't find anything today, those valleys are unexplored. Unexplored. You can go walking in them and find paintings that nobody has seen for 100 and 200 years. And then on the right, you've got some of the 12,000 pages that need careful going through. Many discoveries of different kinds await researchers. And now I'm going to hand over to David Whittleson, a doctoral candidate at the University of the Witwatersrand, about actually doing field work, not just hearing about it.
Hello, everyone. Professor Lewis-Williams asked me to say just a few words about doing fieldwork and working with rock art in South Africa. There are a number of active field projects and research projects in South Africa working with rock art, particularly at the Rock Art Research Institute. But I thought I would just focus on, give you a personal perspective from my own experience, particularly for postgrad students looking to get involved in rock art research, and also for undergrads thinking about trying to get field experience. My own research has been focused on performance theory, applying new ideas and a new theoretical perspective to rock paintings. And the reason for this is that performance theory focuses on meaning in action. So we've seen with Professor Lewis-Williams talk how meaningful the paintings are. And so my work is trying to look to emphasize the creation and the articulation of that meaning in making and using the paintings in order to try and understand more about the rock paintings. And to do that, fieldwork has been particularly important because it means that we will have new paintings to say new things about. Performance theory very briefly focuses on audience-performer interactions, and here I've been using the work of people like Victor Turner, the anthropologist, and Richard Schechner, the American theater director, because in both spheres, performers display either skills or behaviors for and to audiences who observe and assess those skills and behaviors. And that we can go more into that, but for our purposes, that's fine. And for now. But I've been trying to use these ideas to say something more about sound performances. And there are a number that have been ethnographically recorded, such as rites of passage and storytelling and trance dances. But when it comes to rock paintings, it gets a little more tricky because the ethnography that we have tends to be highly technical. What paints did they use, that sort of thing. And we don't really know what happened when the image makers put paint to rock and what happened in that context. So performance theory offers a way to explore these kinds of questions for a practice that we can really only approach in an archaeological way. So for that, I've been doing quite a bit of field work. And so here we have a lovely photo from summer in the Labyrinth Valley in the Eastern Cape. And in going to do field work, I've taken with me performance theory and sound ethnography and rock art literature, the lenses through which I look at the rock paintings in order to say something new about them. And I do this in addition to all of the traditional equipment that one takes with in a backpack, like a camera and a GPS and so on. And I put this picture in just to show that fieldwork can be sort of physically demanding. So the site in this valley that is particularly well known is Storm Shelter. I think it was discovered around 2001 and first published in National Geographic. But to get there, one first has to get into this valley, which is not an easy task, and then walk along one side of the valley, down the steep side of the valley, across the river and up the other side, and then into the shelter. And if you're not particularly motivated to do all of that, just to see some rock paintings, it can be quite an overwhelming feat, but highly rewarding in any case. So my work for my master's and for my PhD has been focused in the Eastern Cape as well, in two areas, the Melrose Ridge and then the Woodhouse district. And both of these areas are in the southern foothills of the Drakensberg Mountains. And I've been working in these areas because they offer different opportunities for the application of theory and for fieldwork itself. So the Melrose Ridge on the Melrose Farm is a well-known area. I think it's been known for over a century. The Linton Panel, which Professor Lewis-Williams mentioned in his talk, comes from this part of the country, and this is a wonderful part of time of the year. In winter, you can see some snow on that peak, but my interest was in just one part of the farm on that ridge. And what's interesting about this ridge is there is a dense concentration of sites. So although there's rock art in all of the valleys of this part of the country, on this particular ridge there are 8 sites, and if you walk from one end to the other, you encounter all of the different sites in series, and all of the sites are visible from the valley below. In other words, the making of images in these sites was a deliberate choice. The choice of site was not by chance. And so that gave me an interesting set of sites to think through similarities and differences and interactions with performance theory. And as you can see here, the sites are all in some ways a little bit similar and a little bit different. And so I could really get to grips with interactions between the paintings and the rock faces, and then think through some of the implied interactions between people and the paintings who were making and viewing the rock paintings on this ridge. And the general conclusion from that master's research was that performance theory is a useful way to consider the practice of rock painting as a kind of sound expressive culture. In other words, it's of a kind with things like the trance dance and storytelling and music and so on. But this was a very general finding, and I wanted to follow up some of the implications from that research for my PhD. So to do that, I've moved to a much larger area, and that's the Woodhouse district, also in the Eastern Cape. And here you can see 2 vistas, one at the top from winter and one at the bottom from summer. It's a really vast area, and what's interesting for my purposes is that it's not particularly well known to researchers. We have a number of historical copies, and some work on selected sites and images has been done by people at museums, but systematic research programs have not been carried out in this part of the country. So what that means is in this vast area of nearly 3,000 kilometers squared, there's a lot more work to do to find the paintings in order to try and say something new about them. But I've been incredibly lucky because most of the survey work, just by chance, had already been done before I became interested in this area. And that was by Mr. Ben McLennan, who is a farmer in the area. And unusually for farmers, he's been particularly interested in documenting in high resolution the rock art sites around where he lives. Ben is affiliated with the Anderson Museum in Dordrecht, one of the Eastern Cape towns, and is the voluntary chairman of that institution. And so when I started working in the Woodhouse district, Ben very generously shared his records with me and allowed me to use them for my research, and also took me to a number of sites. And so I said to Mr. McLennan, how can I help with your work? And very simply, he said, bring me students to assist me with the survey. And at that time, I was in talks with Professor Peter Mitchell at Oxford, and we were able to organize for some first-year students to come and get field experience in surveying for rock art sites in this area. And those students were Gil Thornton and Tom Waits, and they came out and joined us for a week, and we focused on surveying farms, and particularly training Gil and Tom to record sites, to document their locations with the GPS, to fill in site record forms, which are often the only paper records that we have of where sites exist, their condition, and who to contact and how to get there. And then also how to photograph the sites, the images in the shelters, and also to enhance them digitally see details that are not always easy for us to see with the naked eye. So the first part of the survey in that week was at Edendale Farm. As you can see from the satellite photo, it's a particularly rugged part of the country. All of those contours are lines of cliffs with boulders as well that need to be checked to see if there's any rock art. And at this particular farm, Mr. McLennan knew of some rock art and had been to visit, and he walked on one occasion all the way up one side of the valley and didn't find the rock paintings that he'd been told were there. But he sat down to have some tea and a sandwich, and he looked across the valley, and he could see that there were paintings in the shelter across the way, but because the vegetation is so dense, he couldn't get into that site because it was simply impossible to walk across through the trees and the bush. So he went all the way up one side of the valley and then down the other and dropped down into the shelter. And it was only then that he saw just how fantastic the paintings really were. And here you can see the lovely panel of eland, exceptionally well preserved and exhibiting all kinds of different behaviors. And that was the reason that Ben wanted us to go back to this farm and see what else was to be found. So we went back to the farm and we split into pairs, Gil and I on one side and Tom and Ben on the other, each of us with a two-way radio, and we walked along the contours to see what we could find. And we were lucky, and here is a photo of a slide showing one of the sites that we found, entirely new, unknown to the farmer, unknown to anyone else. And on this occasion, Gil found the site by himself, and here he is filling in the site record form, and he took all of the pictures of the site, which we now have documented. And this particular panel has a number of eland in it, which is, as we know from the previous part of the talk, one of the most significant animals in sound belief. The next part of the survey was at Moordenaarspoort Farm, which incidentally is Afrikaans for Murderer's Corner, and that the name comes from an act of revenge that happened on the farm in the 19th century. But we were there to look for rock paintings, and again we split into teams and walked contour paths along the cliffs to see what we could find. And on this occasion, it was Tom and Ben who found a new site previously undocumented, again with a number of eland in them. But the discoveries that we were making didn't stop there. Once back at the accommodation, we would download the photographs from the cameras and look through them to see if there was anything in the course of the day that had caught our attention, but that we had found particularly difficult to see with the naked eye. Traditionally, one would be able to spend a lot of time in a site tracing and then redrawing. But the new technologies that we have allow us to make discoveries quite quickly through digital enhancements. So here is an interesting panel, which is not easy to see with the naked eye, but using digital enhancements such as D-stretch, we can make it easy to see quite quickly. So I'll just flick between these slides to give you a chance to see what becomes more apparent. And you can see that the digital enhancement shows up the human figures on the left, a number of them with their hands raised and possibly hooves as well, all of which is very significant to the trance dances, which are very closely associated with the images themselves, and of course the coiled serpent in the center of the image, which is highly significant for rain and rain making. So there was a lot to see even after getting back in the evenings. But the usefulness of this fieldwork continued to apply to the coursework that Tom and Gil were doing back at Oxford. So they were able to draw on their field experiences in writing up their undergraduate dissertations. Tom focused on rain animals, images of rain animals, and Gil focused on hartebeest antelope. So working with Peter Mitchell as their supervisor, the fieldwork really didn't go to waste, and they were able to use it and build on it later on in their courses. So if you are interested in getting involved in rock art research or in just getting some field experience, please do get in touch with us at the Rock Art Research Institute, and we can make a plan and hopefully get out into the field and make some new discoveries.